Can I thank Julia and also thank Rusi for hosting today's event as obviously one of the oldest think tanks into security and international defence. It is an appropriate place for us to be talking about an issue that is going to challenge not just Europe but the globe for many years to come, at a time when the refugee crisis affecting the Levant and Europe is getting worse, and also when governments across the world are struggling to know how to respond, but also when Britain is building up to a referendum on whether to stay in the European Union. And when this refugee crisis that has flared up just within the last 12 months could well dominate the debate on our relationship with the continent and for decades to come, whether we like it or not. So let me start this morning just with a picture. On a beach, a child, not playing but jumping in the waves, but lying dead, drowned off Europe's shores. Not little Aylan Kurdi, the 3-year-old whose body was found on a Turkish beach late last summer, but a toddler, a little girl washed ashore on Kagia Beach in Greece, lying under a silver blanket while the waves lap and an aid worker sits by. And we don't know her name or where she was from, barely even noticed, as so many children now are dying, drowning, disappearing. Because it's getting harder to help and harder to cope. The refugee crisis is set to get much worse this year unless we act. As hundreds of thousands more Syrians are driven from their homes, thousands more families crossing the Aegean, Europe divided and destabilised, and the far right is on the rise. And the stakes are very high if we just drift on like this, because more people will suffer and drown, more children will disappear, but also disorder, instability and hatred in Europe will keep rising. And here in Britain, Eurosceptics will use this to try to drive us out of Europe, even though Brexit will make it harder to deal with the challenges that we face. And they will win unless we act. This is not beyond us. We have dealt with tougher challenges before, but it does need a comprehensive plan, and it does need David Cameron to change tack. So I want to talk today about how I believe Britain and Europe can rise to the challenge, but we can only do so together. And we should be no doubt about how much the humanitarian crisis is going to get worse this year if we don't act. Turkey expects 600,000 more people to reach its border as the Assad assault on civilians escalate and the Russian bombing goes on. And they've already taken 2.5 million refugees. Of course, people are fleeing, and every one of us would do the same. In Madaya, those who didn't flee were starved. In Homs, those who stayed put were bombed. In Sinjar, the Yazidi women who didn't run were massacred or forced into sex slavery by Daesh. And I found it heartbreaking to see the crayon pictures drawn by a young child on Lesbos of a family being bombed and a neighbour being beheaded. Such was the bloodshed that she had fled. UNHCR say most of those now arriving are from Syria, but there are more fleeing conflict and persecution too, from Iraq, from Afghanistan and Eritrea. And we know too there are others who are joining the convoy who are not refugees, who have safe home to return to. The smugglers' boats haven't stopped. Already this winter, 10 times more have come than last year. And the gangs give discounts if the waves are high. 3,700 people drowned last year. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, students, children, toddlers. And now think for a moment what that will mean when the waves quell and more start to come. If the numbers who come this year, as the EU predict, treble, then that could mean 10,000 people drown on Mediterranean shores this year. Last year, 4 EU countries and the Balkans took most of the strain. They won't be able to do that again. Asylum hostels are full in Sweden. Halls and reception centres are full in Germany. Children's homes are full in Italy. And graveyards are full on some of the islands in Greece. So the humanitarian consequences are serious. 70,000 people are stuck now in makeshift camps in northern Greece, and Save the Children say women and children are arriving in the Balkans with blue lips, exhausted mothers telling aid workers that they cannot keep their babies warm and dry. And on our own border with France lie shanty towns that should shame our two proud nations. In the Calais jungle, families amid an epidemic of scabies and bronchitis, and the flimsy tents in Dunkirk mud, and conditions that aid workers say are worse than they have seen anywhere in conflict and disaster zones across the world. And that's in Europe. That's on our doorstep. But nor are there systems in place to manage this. In Greece, proper registration checks and security checks still aren't happening. In Calais and Dunkirk, thousands of people aren't being assessed at all. And no one has any idea how many are refugees in urgent need of sanctuary and support, and how many have safe homes to return to where immigration rules should be enforced. And no one has any idea how many children there are or where they go. Europol say 10,000 child refugees have just disappeared in Europe. Imagine it. That's 10,000 children. That's like every child in Pontefract and Castleford in my constituency just disappearing, and no one knows where they have gone. Probably into the arms of criminal gangs, traffickers, drug and prostitution rings, exploitation and slavery. And one aid worker told me that teenage boys were being given discounts by the smugglers if they agreed to carry drugs or weapons. Lack of checks or controls make this easy for organised crime to exploit. Gangs making millions, profiting from desperation, preying on the vulnerable. Petty criminals taking their chance among the disorder, and concentrated groups of young men sexually harassing and assaulting women, and lawless spaces like the Calais jungle providing no protection against violence or sexual abuse. And extremists and terrorists can exploit this too, just as one did in the Paris attacks, hiding among refugees as he travelled back from Syria to France. It is too easy for more to do the same. So the security threat, as well as the humanitarian crisis, is going to get worse this year unless we act. And it is hardly surprising that public anxiety is growing. Across the continent, many people have shown immense support for helping refugees. On Lesbos' northern shore, I met Spanish lifeguards, Dutch paramedics, Palestinian doctors, French nurses, Swedish aid workers, all ready with food and dry clothes, all volunteering to help save the lives of fellow human beings. And here across Britain too, we've seen amazing volunteers, communities, faith groups, raising sponsorship, donating clothes, sending vans of help to Calais, finding different ways to help. But plenty of people are also getting worried by lacks of checks or controls, by the images of crowds not knowing how many there are or where they're going or when it will stop, by the Paris attacks, by the Cologne assaults, and by a growing fear that maybe this is just out of control or too hard to solve. Many people believe that we have a moral responsibility to help those fleeing conflict or persecution, but they want reassurance that governments have got a grip, and they're troubled that there just doesn't seem to be a plan. And the far right is exploiting that fear at a time when people already feel insecure as living standards have fallen, when people are already anxious about changes to their communities and the pace of immigration, and when politics had already started to fracture and the seeds of rising nationalism had already been sown. So all across Europe, far-right anti-immigration or nationalist parties are on the rise. We've seen Pegida and the AfD polling at record levels in Germany, the National Front at record levels in France. In Sweden and Denmark, far-right parties have won seats in Parliament, and in Poland and Hungary, they run the government. And back here in Britain, UKIP and Eurosceptics are playing on those fears to push us out of Europe altogether. So across Europe, politics feels deeply unstable, and this will have real consequences for democracy that we cannot just wish away. But perhaps more importantly, community cohesion is also being threatened as racism and hatred are rising too. So Europe's institutions are not yet doing enough to rise to the challenge. Old ways of operating are too slow. Old rules such as Schengen and Dublin aren't working. And old assumptions about shared values are undermined as countries disagree on the right approach. Eastern and Western Europe divided, Germany and Angela Merkel out on a limb, Greece seen as a weak link, and Britain trying to go it alone. So yes, the stakes are high. Fail to manage the humanitarian crisis this year and thousands more people will suffer, thousands more people will drown, thousands more children will disappear. Fail to increase security and border controls this year, and it will be easier for criminals and extremists to exploit the crisis. And fail to get a grip, and the instability in Europe will grow. 3 years ago, at a Shadow Home Secretary security briefing from MI5, they said to me at the end of the meeting, "You need to understand Syria. It's going to affect everything you have to deal with. It's going to change everything." At the time, they were talking about radicalisation in Britain, but they were more right than any of us knew. From the failed Arab Spring to the rise of Daesh, to Russian support for Assad, to the fleeing of terrorists, to the fleeing of refugees, and to the terrorist threat. And who knows where it ends? With the United Kingdom leaving Europe, then losing Scotland too, with Greece being forced out, with far-right parties rising across a continent, with the fracturing and the dividing of the entire European Union. But of course, it doesn't have to be like this. This is not beyond us. We have faced far greater challenges on our continent before. The 1 million people who have arrived make up just 0.2% of our combined European population. And it is still less than the regular legal migration into the continent from the rest of the world each year. But we do need action and not drift. Solving the refugee crisis in Europe means championing our humanity, our security, and our stability all at the same time. We need both compassion and order, both sanctuary and borders. Open borders will not work. We cannot do the security checks or maintain stability and order that we need. But nor will it work for countries to abandon our common humanity and to refuse to help refugees. And it will not work if countries try to go it alone, be it Germany promising sanctuary to all or Hungary trying to send everyone home. We need a comprehensive plan, not tinkering at the edges, and it needs to have international support. Most important, of course, is to tackle the cause of the crisis with the strongest possible pressure from across the globe on Russia to stop civilian bombing, to get the Syrian peace process back on track, and to put humanitarian protection at the heart of the talks. That looks really hard right now, but we cannot let up. But there should also be similar diplomatic initiatives to address the flow of refugees from Afghanistan and Eritrea too. Britain is right to lead the way on international aid, jobs and schools for the Levant, where most of the refugees want to stay and where there is greatest chance for them returning home. And the London conference will make a real difference if those pledges are delivered. More still needs to be done with Turkey to stop people setting off on dangerous journeys in the first place or passing through if they are not refugees. And the whole of the world should be taking more refugees. Canada has increased the numbers that they take in just a short time. But the US is still doing too little, and many other countries across the globe need to do far more. This is a global crisis, and everybody needs to respond. But within Europe itself, we also need much more substantial and urgent reform. First, we need the proper security checks, faster asylum assessments and stronger borders to stop the trafficking gangs. Politicians say the words about hotspots or registration in Greece, but it isn't happening, and it's only a matter of weeks before more people start to come. Schengen was designed for a different age, and Europe's governments should stop trying to save it. Expecting Greece and Italy to deliver all of the security, smuggling, immigration and asylum checks for an entire continent is impossible. Each country needs to know how many people have arrived and who they are, whether their own citizens have gone to Syria to join Daesh or whether and where they have tried to return. And we need to protect children. Because from Italy alone, 4,000 child refugees have disappeared, but the Italian authorities have no idea whether to look for them locally or whether they are long gone because they don't have the border checks. Too many European elites are clinging onto Schengen as a shibboleth. There are far more important things they should be fighting for than the freedom just not to have your passport checked as you travel from Germany to France. Second, All European countries need to offer sanctuary, not just some. There was a promise to relocate 160,000 refugees. Only 400 of them have been relocated so far from Italy and Greece. And every country across Europe needs to do more. Some suggest Europe shouldn't take refugees at all, but how can we expect Jordan and Turkey and Lebanon to do so much if we do nothing? Just because we can't help everyone doesn't mean we should help no one. And the right kind of refugee programme can actually help challenge the radicalisation and security threat from Daesh within Europe too. Syrian refugees in Britain are already working with the police to persuade British Muslims not to get drawn in or to take their families to a war zone. Daesh want people to believe that they are the caliphate where Muslims should run from Western persecution. If instead the West is giving sanctuary to Muslim refugees who are fleeing Daesh persecution, that undermines their propaganda, their poisonous recruitment. Third, we need EU budget reform. So more of the budget goes directly to help refugees and those countries most heavily affected. Greece urgently needs more support. They could easily double the amount of EU support that's put in. Fourth, we need to develop a proper new strategy of stronger enforcement to stop the dangerous illegal routes from Turkey, alongside developing safe and legal ways to apply for sanctuary in Europe instead. The two things have to go hand in hand if it is to pull the profits from the smugglers' gangs. And fifth, we need a serious integration plan. Many of those who are given temporary sanctuary will want to return home to rebuild their countries, as the Bosnian refugees did many years ago. But while they are here, they are our neighbours. And that also means they need to respect the values, culture and laws of the country that has welcomed them in. And so we need that Europe-wide action to tackle the problem. But here in Britain, Eurosceptics instead are arguing that the refugee crisis is more reason just to pull out of Europe altogether. That is nonsense. It's also dangerous. For a start, Brexit won't magic away the refugee crisis or keep it further from our shores, quite the opposite. This is a Syria-driven refugee crisis, not one of Europe's making. And refugees who have family in Britain or who speak good English will keep trying to come here, whether we leave the EU or not. We're already out of the Schengen zone, so Brexit won't strengthen border checks. And based on the conversations that I have had with French officials who've told me the political pressure that they are under to ditch the Calais arrangements, I agree with David Cameron and with the former British ambassador to Paris, Sir Peter Ricketts, that our borders could end up back at Dover. But more importantly, we would lose vital cooperation through Europol, through information sharing and the European arrest warrant to stop traffickers and extremists exploiting the crisis. And faced with a problem that crosses borders, unilateralism just won't work. If we want to prevent people ending up in the mud in Calais in the first place, we need the French, the Italians, the Greeks to check people's asylum claims along the way. If we want to get Turkey to prevent traffickers sending so many people to a watery grave, Britain cannot do that alone. We need the pressure and support from the whole of the continent. But here's where I disagree with the Prime Minister. So far, David Cameron's strategy on the refugee crisis has been to refuse to engage with Europe at all. He's happy to support aid to the region, and I applaud that. Under pressure, he's agreed to limited sanctuary for refugees from Syrian camps. But he won't work with Europe on the problems across the Channel. And he panders to the far right with his rhetoric about swarms of migrants in Calais and his refusal to separate refugees from immigration. And in the end, that just will not work. It makes it harder to get the EU reforms that we here in Britain need, harder to get the changes to Schengen or harder to get the French to act over Calais. Nor will it win the argument against the Eurosceptics, because as long as there is growing disorder in Europe over refugees, the Eurosceptics will be able to play on people's fears. As long as we fail to sort Calais, people will be worried, and they will worry that maybe the answer is to pull out altogether, even though that will make it worse. And the Prime Minister too needs to do more to separate immigration and asylum. People in Britain are concerned about immigration, and I think more changes will be needed, including across Europe. But that is different from refugees. It is different when people have no safe home to return to. And it doesn't help the debate on refugees or the EU by confusing the two. And so, yes, that does mean, as part of that, as part of being engaged in the European debate, as part of finding long-term solutions, Britain also has to help more refugees. Taking 4,000 people a year from the camps near Syria, as the Prime Minister's promised, is not enough. Last summer, I called on councils, communities, faith groups to come forward and offer to help. Some have accommodation and support ready in place, but they're still waiting for the government to bring refugees in. We should ask them how much more they can do. As I said then, if every city or county took just 10 families, that would help 10,000 people very quickly. And we should start too with those who are in Europe as well as in the camps near the region who have family in Britain who could look after them or sponsor them. And we should act swiftly to help children, starting with Lord Alf Dubb's amendment to help 3,000 lone refugees in Europe that will be voted on in the House of Lords in a few weeks' time. Alf came to Britain as a child of the kinder transport over 70 years ago. It saved him from the Holocaust. Now he is asking us to help a new generation of child refugees. And here's why it matters. A court case brought by Citizens UK a few weeks ago decided that 3 teenage refugees whose closest family are in Britain can join relatives who will look after them while their asylum cases are heard, rather than having to wait alone with no one to look after them in Calais. However, one teenager's case was not successful. His name was Masood from Afghanistan, and he was trying to join his sister, who was a British citizen, in London. The reason his case failed is because before it made it to court, his body was found. He was suffocated to death in the back of a lorry. He didn't wait for the court case. He was 15. He had no one to stop him taking crazy risks. That's what teenagers do. A teenage boy's body in a lorry, a little girl's body on a beach. We can't keep standing by while children die, while children drown, or while children disappear. So it's time now to do as Alf Dubbs asks, to draw on those same values that stood us in good stead generations ago. The same values on which we in Britain helped build European cooperation after the Holocaust, when we in Britain worked to establish the Council of Europe, the European Convention, the partnership between France and Britain that started the common market and led to the EU in the first place. Winston Churchill didn't call for isolationism, for unilateralism or narrow nationalism when he said we needed European cooperation through which people could dwell in peace, safety and freedom. Today's refugee crisis is not beyond us to cope with. We faced tougher challenges before. Rebuilding Europe after 2 world wars, reuniting a continent after decades of Cold War, restoring peace to the Balkans, resettling refugees, defending democracy and human rights, standing in solidarity with all those fleeing persecution, because we know we are stronger when we stand together than we leave people to sink or swim alone, building stability and security together for peace, safety and freedom once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yvette. That was amazing. Yes.
Thank you very much indeed. My name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former intelligence analyst in Customs and Excise. At the time, Mr. Andrew Parker came to sort out very serious problems in our organisation, and we still owe him an enormous debt for what he did for us and for everyone else. My question is based on a work I did in 2010 on information exchanges between EU member state law enforcement agencies and therefore obviously with Central European institutions and beyond. It's as much about within a country and between countries and to and from the central agencies. It really has to be a mesh and it won't work without that. I believe the Commission, frankly, has something of a problem with relations with NATO. Do you see this is perhaps more in the Central Med, but I know there's talk now of in the Aegean. Do you see any signs that the UK, as a key NATO member, can give an impetus to closer and better talking between NATO and the EU central institutions? And of course, France would be a natural, and Italy in the maritime, they would be natural partners for this. Thank you.
Yeah, and I don't know the detail of the NATO and EU Commission information sharing at the moment, but there is a principle here which is an important one, which is, first of all, that you need far more extensive cooperation, intelligence security sharing, and security cooperation, and dealing with the smuggler gangs, for example, the trafficking gangs, who now have immense operations right across Europe. I mean, where do all the black flimsy boats come from? There is a whole operation, a massive criminal operation in supplying those boats, supplying some of the fake life jackets, the whole operation that then takes place right across Europe. And actually, we are failing to crack those smugglers gangs, and we need far more cooperation, far more intelligence sharing in order to be able to do so. And I think there is a huge role that Britain should be playing. This is something which individual countries cannot possibly solve. It needs those networks across Europe. But in order to build the cooperation, you do also need some leadership to make that happen. Germany has traditionally provided a lot of that leadership, but actually Angela Merkel is not in the easiest of positions to provide some of the leadership on cooperation between European countries and institutions and NATO right now, whereas actually Britain should be. And that, I think, is my point about that, if this is not simply, you can't just have even a sort of semi-engagement with Europe on this. There is a huge potential for David Cameron to make a massive difference by leading that debate about how NATO and the Commission, how European countries and how police forces should work together.
Thank you. There's a question here. Lady in the front.
Hilda Rapp, Centre for International Peacebuilding. Thank you very much for a very powerful presentation. It's sort of interesting that yesterday we had perhaps the candidate for Secretary General of the UN speaking, and it made me wonder when you referred to Canada, the US, and the role of other countries, and mentioned several times this is a global problem for all of us, why you didn't talk more about the possible role of the UN in this particular horrendous scenario. And I'd be interested to hear what you think about that. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's a fair criticism, because I think what's also interesting is that, and I think it's probably partly because I concentrated on Europe, where actually it has struck me on visits to some of the areas most heavily affected that the UNHCR is not playing the role that it could, because this is Europe. And that European governments are not giving the UNHCR the power and the licence to operate in areas where it could make a big difference. That includes, I think, in Greece and in the Balkans, but it also includes Calais as well, where actually I think we should do what we did around Sangatte and bring in the UN to do assessments. If the French authorities are not able to rapidly do so, then bring in the UNHCR and fund them to do so instead. So I think there is a huge potential for the UNHCR to do more. It's also struck me in some areas where I talked to some of the UNHCR aid workers who said it was, frankly, it was much easier to operate in other countries across the globe than to operate in Europe, and their hands were tied in different areas where they could have done more.
Hi, it's Emily Ashton at BuzzFeed. I've just got a couple of quick questions. You said you agreed with David Cameron about if we leave the EU, the border with France will come to Dover. Do you agree with him about this scenario of camps, simply relocating to Kent, 5,000 people suddenly living in Kent? And the other thing is, with taking on more refugees, do you have a figure in mind for how many you would like to come a year?
First of all, I think on the issue about the borders, I've spoken to senior French officials and diplomats who have said to me how much pressure they are under, particularly with the level of policing resources that they need around Calais, but also with the overall arrangement, the public pressure that they are under, and how much easier it would be for them if they didn't have to continue to operate those arrangements. And that's why I do agree with David Cameron, with Sir Peter Ricketts, that actually we could end up with the border moving back and with border checks moving back to Dover. I don't think the Prime Minister has been right, though, to talk about the way he does about swarms of migrants at Calais, or to use that kind of rhetoric. I actually don't think that's helpful. I also think that what is happening in Calais actually would be illegal in Britain, because I've met 11 and 12-year-old refugee, 12-year-old children who are there. That's about the same age as my kids. And they're there with nobody looking after them and no child protection taking place. You could not have that happen in Britain. It would be against the law to allow that to continue. So I think it's right to say that the border checks would move. I think it's wrong to sort of exploit the sense of alarm that people have around what's happening, when actually what we should be looking at is at practical things that will make a difference. Oh, sorry, in the numbers. Oh, so I said originally we talked about if every city or county took just 10 refugee families, that would enable us to help 10,000 refugees this year. What I think we should do is then to ask communities across the country how many more people that they believe that they could help and how many more people you could give support. And in addition to that, to provide support for 3,000 child refugees, as Alf Dubs has called for.
So, 2 questions here and then one there.
Matt Brown from the Ministry of Defence. First of all, thank you very much. Very thought-provoking, and absolutely agree there's a definite moral and ethical responsibility. Very interested, and it was good to hear that you mentioned at the regional, local level there's councils, people standing by that are offering help. And you touched on this, I believe, in your last answer. But do they, when they are considering the help and what they can actually provide, how far do they project into the future that help and that sustainability of that help and provision can go on for? The second point to my question, which I guess is kind of related, is that absolutely, as I mentioned, I believe there's something that should be done here, but are there other pockets in places, Africa, other pockets of the MENA region, etc., that we are seeing similar things happen, and should we therefore, yes, Syria is, the headline bill at the moment, but is this something that could either become a precedent that we should then, treat every case in the same way, or I'd be keen to get your views on that.
Okay. So first of all, on the support from local councils and communities, the challenge for local councils, of course, is seeing huge cuts in their budgets going forward. So it is difficult for them to make long-term plans about what they would be able to do. And also what they're able to do does depend on what support the government is able to give them. We had a period last year where the government seemed to be only offering very short-term support for those areas that took asylum seekers or refugees, and actually that's going to just make it harder for them to plan the support in place. So it's welcome that Richard Harrington has done more to try and put a longer term support in place to do that, and also that the government is now starting to make noises about all parts of Britain being part of this and coming forward and offering help, rather than refugees just ending up in some areas, not others, and some areas not doing their bit at all. In terms of what the issues are in terms of the rest of the world, I think, in the end, you do want to try and help people as close to home as possible. So I spoke to a family in Beirut who were desperate to stay as close to the Syrian border as possible. They wanted to be able to go home. They have family still across the border. Their problem, however, was that they couldn't work. They couldn't get work permits. The girls were in school, but the boys weren't. And that was putting them under pressure, and they were starting to worry about whether they should travel and whether they should use the last of their savings to try and travel to Europe instead. So I do think that the government is right to say the priority should be to provide that help in the region, and that means Africa as well. So we know Kenya, for example, we know there are other parts of the world where there are huge numbers of refugee camps, and we should be providing the support and the sustainable help in those regions. But we also then can't ignore the people who do travel to Europe and to do make these long journeys. And I think making a kind of an arbitrary distinction and saying some, as the way the government's been doing, and saying those who are somehow in the camps in the region are more vulnerable than those who have travelled to Europe, I don't think just is right.
Thank you very much for your talk, which I much appreciated. The question is, how do we help David Cameron and the government to shift in their attitude? It seemed to me there may be two possible arguments which they may listen to. One is that Syrians who come here and from other countries of war, we do have the potential to help them learn about peacemaking. Europe does have a great deal to teach in that. And Syria is such a deep-seated problem that the whole issue of how you create a multicultural society is vital to that country. And of course, the other point is that 100 years ago, we're celebrating a great deal of the First World War events, but of course, we shaped the countries of Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, with very little attention to how you create a society which can actually cooperate and work together. And so we've created them a huge problem for them. That also leaves an obligation with us to do something about it. Is there not both a positive appreciation we can actually do something about it, we can help develop the peacemaking programs and so on, which mean that those who return do return with new ideas, but also because we've got an obligation in that regard.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point because, the evidence from Bosnia was that we gave sanctuary to very many people from Bosnian conflict at the height of the conflict, but also very many of them then returned in order to rebuild their country. And therefore, you're right that therefore for people fleeing Syria and also Iraq, the chance to be able to return home to rebuild, but also to be able to do so with skills and support will be important. I think... there's also the point you made about the obligation that we have and to support countries that are sustainable and that have the networks that are sustainable. Somebody had also said to me about the problem about the British and European attitude to the Arab Spring was that there was a sort of sense, this will solve itself, this will all be fine. Whereas actually not enough diplomatic effort had been put into building civil society, building the civil society and community relationships and organisations that could make any process like that sustainable rather than just see it fall apart, as obviously it's done so badly in Syria.
Yes, gentleman there.
Thanks. Kevin Schofield from politicshome.com. You mentioned in your speech about the link between the migration debate and the upcoming referendum debate. I just wondered how worried you are personally that Britain could be almost sleepwalking towards Brexit if the whole debate becomes about migration. And just on one other matter, on a defence-related matter, I'm just interested to get your thoughts on Emily Thornberry's proposition that Trident could become obsolete because of water-based drones, which could make submarines make the seas opaque and make them more of a target. Thanks.
Okay. So on the referendum, I think this is not going to be a debate just about the economy. And it's not going to be a debate just about jobs. I think there is an immensely important debate about jobs. In my constituency, I've got factories that export to Europe and where the staff, the businesses, the managers have said how much they are concerned about us pulling out and how much is at stake. So there will be, of course, a lot of debate about jobs. But, of course, immigration is going to be part of that debate, and the refugee crisis is going to be part of that debate because of the way in which we can expect the humanitarian crisis from Syria to get worse this year unless more action is taken. So we just cannot run away from that. And I think people who think you can just ignore that debate actually are kidding themselves. But that's why You see, my argument is that we will be first of all, you have to separate out immigration and asylum. I think that the Prime Minister was right to talk about the issues around benefits as part of the immigration debate, because actually it's what people, when I've talked to people around the countries, they see it as a sort of fairness issue. Around that. But the issues around refugees are different, because these are people who have no safe home to return to, who have come from Syrian conflict particularly, but also Afghanistan and Iraq. That is a global crisis. This is not about Europe. It is not being driven from Europe. So we have to separate out the debate about refugees from the debate about immigration. It is really important to do so. And that's why I'm worried that the Prime Minister's refusal to separate out the debate about refugees from the wider debate about immigration will actually make it harder to have a sensible debate on Europe. And I'm also worried that that sense of that people have of disorder, of this not being under control, of of governments not having a grip on this, will play into Eurosceptics' hands. They will be able to use this to build more alarm about Europe, despite the fact that actually, if we're not part of the European Union, it will be much harder to deal with the refugee crisis. So Brexit will make it harder, not easier, to deal with the refugee crisis. However, if we don't have practical measures to respond to the refugee crisis, then that will be exploited by the Eurosceptics. It will be exploited, and people will be anxious. So yeah, I am worried that we will drift towards Brexit if the Prime Minister doesn't do more in order to be able to have to be part of a Europe-wide strategy to deal with the refugee crisis. Trying one. So look, I take very seriously the expert advice from Lord Alan West, and I think that we shouldn't think we can kind of fudge our way through these things. I've always said I'm a multilateralist and not a unilateralist, and I think that we should carry on supporting the renewal of Trident.
Thank you. I'm Jessup from the American Embassy. I had a question of clarification about something you said about how the United States needs to do more. From where I sit, the United States has given over $5.1 billion to the Syrian crisis since it began. Last year, we accepted 85,000 refugees, about 10,000 of which were from Syria. Next year, it's going to be 100,000. We've done a lot of humanitarian assistance into Syria and the region. We're trying to solve the source of the problem, both militarily and diplomatically. So I'm curious as to what you mean by the United States needs to do more.
I think the United States could take more people from the Syrian crisis. I know that President Obama has been very keen to do so, and I know that there's also been considerable resistance from some of the Republicans in Congress to doing so, and I think that is a huge problem. It's great to have the investment from the United States and also from Britain for aid in the region. That is immensely important, and I would strongly welcome and congratulate the US from doing so in the same way that I have done for the UK government for doing so. But it's not enough to simply provide aid. When you have so many people who are travelling and who are making these perilous journeys, there are also people who need to be given sanctuary. And if we simply give aid and therefore think that Jordan and Turkey and Lebanon can do this alone, it's really hard to ask them to do more, especially as more refugees are arriving from Aleppo, if other countries are not also doing their bit. So I hope that President Obama will be successful in getting the additional Syrian refugees arriving in the United States. Canada has increased the number of refugees they are taking very, very quickly and very suddenly in a short period of time since the election, and that is really welcome, but I think other countries could do more. And the US has such a proud history of taking people and taking refugees from all over the world. I think in this case, I think David Miliband has said this from the IRC in the States as well. It would also be great for the US to do more in terms of Syria too.
Yes, gentleman there. And then at the back.
Thank you. Mark Rapley, RUSI member. Is there any work underway to improve the accommodation and facilities and all the other management that needs to be there in these camps in Calais and so on? I mean, shouldn't there be a concrete proposal to work with the French to start improving it immediately?
So the French have started to put in place better shelter, and have been putting up a series of different sort of cabins and wooden shelters in place that are obviously provide better humanitarian protection than some of the flimsy tents that people have been living in. I think that in the end, though, what you need is a sort of comprehensive plan for Calais, to deal with Calais, that can't just be the French, although a lot of it needs to be led by the French, because my concern is that what they will do is simply create a sticking plaster, a bit like returning to Sangatte, where what you need is, first of all, you need everybody to be assessed. And at the core is the problem that we still don't know who a lot of the people are. They're not being assessed, not having asylum claims assessed, not having humanitarian protection issues assessed, not even looking at in terms of the number of children, where they are, and so on. So you need the assessments, you need shelter, and you need humanitarian aid as well. But you then also need a strategy for I think preventing people ending up in Calais in the first place. And that goes back to one of the points that I made in the speech, which was, in the end, you need a way to have both the sort of enforcement to prevent the sort of dangerous journeys and the smugglers' journeys, alongside safe legal ways to apply for sanctuary. And what Britain's done by having their vulnerable persons scheme, and the idea that you could apply directly from the camps in the regions, actually in principle is the right approach to say people should have a legal way of being able to apply for sanctuary rather than make these dangerous journeys. The trouble is, because it's small scale, because it's just Britain in isolation, it's not actually preventing anybody from travelling at all to Calais or to anywhere else. If we did more to give people the chance to apply if they have family in Britain, for example from Greece or from Turkey, that also might prevent people from travelling. And then also the French need to be able to apply immigration rules. So those who are not refugees, enforce immigration rules need to be enforced. So there is a partial, the truth, honestly, there's a partial plan from France at the moment around shelter, but my view is that is not a comprehensive enough plan and won't actually deal both with the humanitarian issues and also the wider safety and security issues that we face.
Thank you. Question at the back.
Hi, Phil Macaulay from Polity. Yvette, what does a peace process look like? It doesn't seem very visible to me. I'm used to seeing presidents at Camp David calling world leaders to account, having meetings, having processes. That seems to no longer be the case. So I was wondering what your vision for a peace process would be.
And I think this feels very hard at the moment, because as long as Russia is backing Assad with the scale of bombardment, the evidence shows as well that the Russian bombings are not against Daesh. They're not in areas where Daesh are operating. Instead, they are areas where the opposition forces are, and also where civilians are as well. And I think if we don't get the pressure on Russia, Russia is the pivotal player in this. If we don't have the pressure on Russia, then in the end, nothing will change. And so that needs to be, I think, the focus.
Just have time for a couple more questions. Lady at the front and the lady in the middle.
Hi, my name is Roberta Maggi. I'm from the Italian Embassy. I'm wondering about two things. First of all, before you were talking about Italy needing to expand their checks at the border, so I wanted to know if maybe you could expand on maybe if there are any comprehensive plans that are planning to do that. And my second question would be about the Gulf countries, because it seems to me that they aren't doing much to take refugees in, and that is a big problem, because unlike us, they could take in refugees and avoid them crossing the Mediterranean and going on to journeys where most of them end up drowning. So if you could expand on what diplomatic measures are being taken with the Gulf countries in that regard. Thank you.
So on the border, I think my view is that the Schengen system isn't working anymore, and therefore, for Italy to know who has left the country, who has come into the country. If Italy knows the number of people, it has the registration processes in Italy are clearly far more advanced than they are in Greece, and so has information about who has arrived in the country, but not who leaves. And therefore not knowing whether children have left the country because there's no border check, there's no passport check at the border as you travel into France or into Austria, into different parts of Europe. So that's where I think that information could also then help protect children. It's that kind of border checks that I think is really important. I agree with you, the Gulf states do need to do more in terms of taking sanctuary. And what you really need is the leadership that Britain showed with the aid conference, with Germany, with Norway, with Kuwait, with the UN, was really important to get that international aid, but you need the same kind of leadership. You need the same sort of pledging conference around refugees as well.
Last question, gentleman there.
Hello, Abdullah Wanayan from Kuwait Embassy. Just commenting on regarding what the Gulf states have been doing. As for Kuwait, we already have, as you know, we have brought in 3 of the conferences of Syria to help Syria, pledging from 300 million from every time and giving the delivering of the pledges. So we have reached almost 1 billion. Another thing is, and we're not counting also the Red Crescent that we have. I'm just talking about only the government that has pledges. Another thing is because demographically speaking, Kuwait, we already have 15% of our demographics are Syrians. So imagine even if we give even more, which is, we're talking about a space of 72 kilometers in Kuwait, and already we have 15% of the demographics are Syrians. That's it. Thank you.
And I'm glad I had just referred to Kuwait's leadership as part of the aid conference before you spoke. I think, look, the challenge will be over the next 12 months for all countries to do more, and the financial support will be particularly important. But the question as well, actually for all countries, is going to be working out how to cope with the higher levels of refugees during this period. And when you see for Lebanon, a quarter of the population, of course, are now refugees. The way in which the countries sort of next to Syria are coping with a huge amount of refugees. And I can't comment on the details in terms of Kuwait, but I do think, if you look across Europe, we in Britain can do more. And if you take that 4,000 people who the Prime Minister has said would take from Syria, that 4,000 is actually only around 1% of immigration into Britain each year. So it's not even like it's 1% of the population, no, it's 1% of immigration into Britain each year. So I know that Britain can do more. I would just urge all countries to think about what more they can do, because I don't think we will have a choice this year.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to just quickly add a little remark of my own. I mean, I think what Yvette's saying about everyone doing more and cooperating is so important, but I also think business has a role in this as well. It was quite interesting at PwC in Davos recently. We just launched the new CEO survey and ask a question every year about what keeps CEOs awake at night. And one of the top answers was geopolitical instability and the global refugee crisis, and it really is impacting on globalization. And I think it's really important that business plays a role, and I think they can play a very effective role in supporting nations getting together and cooperating. But I'd like to thank now Yvette for such a thought-provoking and amazing talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much.